Good. Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to have you all with us today. My name is Doug Dixon. I'm part of the Future of Aging Coalition, a group of organizations in Boston that's bringing you this webinar today. You're one of 370 people who've signed up for this webinar today from across the country, the US, and also from 18 other countries. And we're excited to have all of you join us today. Our last event featured Louise Aronson, who is author of the best-selling book Elderhood. And at that event, we talked about health and medicine in later life. And we highly recommend her book if you haven't already read it. I'm also board chair of Encore Boston Network, one of the sponsors of our webinar today, where we believe that people over 50 have a unique opportunity to make a difference in the world today. And I'm guessing that we all share that view. But sadly, not everyone has equal access to work, to learning, to civic engagement, the things that often give us meaning and purpose in later life. So today we turn our attention to this topic of meaning and purpose with a particular focus on the way that age, race, and other identities combine to shape our options. We believe this topic is especially relevant at a time when the pandemic and the movement for racial justice have highlighted the impact of bias and disparities based on age, race, and other identities. We'll be exploring this topic today with the help and expertise of researchers from Boston College and the Center on Aging and Work there, from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and the University of Miami and Ohio. Before I introduce the first speaker, I'd like to take a minute to cover a few Zoom logistics. First of all, we're using the Zoom webinar platform today, which is a little bit different from some of the versions that you probably are more familiar with. So everyone will be on mute throughout the session. And the chat function will not be available. But you can use the Q&A function, which is on the bottom bar, the menu. And we encourage you to use that throughout the presentations to indicate questions that you may have. And we'll come back to those questions during the Q&A session that will follow the presentations. If you see someone else's question that you're interested in, you can upvote that question. So rather than duplicating it, you can just indicate that that's also a question of interest to you. In the upper bar on the right side, you see a bar called View Options. If you click on that, you'll see a variety of options. The one we recommend and that we think is probably most useful for this session is the side-by-side session. Side-by-side view, and that will allow you to see the slides when they're being used, as well as an image of the presenter. And you can make adjustments to the size of the image by clicking one corner of the image screen and enlarging that, or making it smaller if you choose. And a reminder that this event today will be recorded. And we will be sending you a link to the recording next week, along with other program information. The Future of Aging Coalition is grateful for the following sponsors of this event today: Encore Boston Network, the Center on Aging and Work at Boston College, the CNAP Alliance, the Fuss Center for Research on Aging and Intergenerational Studies at LaSalle University, and the Massachusetts Gerontology Association. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who will set the stage for our discussion and introduce other presenters. Dr. Christina Matz, who is known to most of us as Tina, is Associate Professor at Boston College School of Social Worker, where she's chair of the Older Adults and Families field of practice, director of the Spears Fellows in Aging Program, and co-director of the Center on Aging and Work. Her research focuses on meaningful engagement in later life, and its effects on the health and well-being of individuals, families, organizations, communities, and society. She's co-lead of the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare's Grand Challenge, focusing on advancing long and productive lives. Dr. Katz has co-authored more than 40 scholarly articles, book chapters, numerous reports, and issue briefs. She teaches courses in research methods and practice with older adults in home and community settings, and has facilitated working partnerships with several Boston area community organizations, including Encore Boston Network, Empower Success Corps, the Waltham Council on Aging, and the Massachusetts Service Alliance. And now, Tina, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Doug. And good afternoon, and thanks so much for all of you for being here today. I'm going to spend my time today just kind of talking about what this idea of intersectionality is and why it's important. And then our wonderful panelists here today will discuss their specific research and how it used an intersectional lens. Okay. Next slide, please. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about the Center on Aging and Work at Boston College. The center was established in 2005 by Marcy Pickett-Sufis and Mick Smyer, and it's a unique research center that focuses on what we feel is a defining issue of our time, this intersection between aging and work. The center seeks to better understand the interplay between aging and work, both from the employers and the employees' perspective, and both at the national and global level. We consider both paid and unpaid forms of work because we feel it's important to acknowledge and understand other forms of labor that older adults often engage in, but that tend to come without a paycheck. And these activities tend to be undervalued. So caregiving, whether it be for grandchildren or for an ill or disabled spouse or parent, as well as volunteerism or other forms of informal helping within communities. And learning and education in later life is also part of this picture. As education in the United States is tended to be designed and structured for younger adults, and therefore restricting pathways for midlife and older adults in important ways. So the Center on Aging and Work is grateful for the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, who has funded our work for, since its inception in 2005. Currently, the Sloan Foundation funds the Sloan Research Network on Aging and Work, which is an international network of scholars who do work in this space, several of whom may be joining us today. And all of the panelists here today are affiliated with the Center on Aging and Work in some way. Next slide, please. Now, why is how we engage as we age so important? Oh, back a slide, please. No, it's this one. You're right. Thank you. Why is how we engage as we age so important? Well, we're living in a time where people are living longer than ever before. You're all familiar with the statistics. But here you can see we've had huge gains in life expectancy since 1900. This graph shows that life expectancy from birth, which is the blue line here, is now about 30 years higher than it was at the turn of the century. And while there's been, discussion right now about how life expectancy may fall as a result of the coronavirus pandemic that we're all amidst right now, as you can see in this chart, you can see the little blip with the flu pandemic in 1918. It's possible and expected that we will rebound in terms of life expectancies from the coronavirus and see future gains in longevity in the future. Next slide, please. So these increases in longevity have given way to the emergence of essentially a new stage during older adulthood. Right? Some have called this the third age. It arrives after midlife, which is often seen as the second age, or when career and family are prominent, and before the fourth age, which is seen as the time where significant functional decline begins to occur towards the end of life. So those in the second age may lack adequate discretionary time for engaging in various activities due to having family and employment obligations. The third age is kind of seen as a possible window of opportunity in the lifespan to finally engage in roles and activities that were not possible at other stages. And so I think this quote by Lillian Rubin in her book, 60 on Up, I use it frequently, describes the issue well. All of us are now in uncharted territory, a stage of life not seen before in human history. And whether woman or man, whether working class or professional, we're all wondering how we'll live, what we'll do, who we'll be for the next 20 or 30 years. And the reason why I kind of like this quote is because it implies a couple of things. First, that there is really no roadmap for this new and emerging stage of life that we're seeing with increases in longevity. There are really no age-related norms or structured patterns to guide activity, unlike other stages in life, which are characterized by education or raising a family or primary work years, that kind of thing. And two, it implies that what we do is intimately tied to our perceptions of who we are. And we know that that is really important for health and well-being in later life. So work, entrepreneurship, community engagement, caregiving, lifelong learning, all of these activities may be part of this. And we find meaning through these identities. And certainly the need to find purpose and meaning and to form and maintain meaningful personal relationships does not diminish with age. In fact, from a developmental standpoint, some suggest that these goals become more salient in later life. Next slide. However, the frame that we use here is extremely important and really matters. So concepts that have kind of been associated with this idea of the third age, such as successful aging, productive aging, working longer, encore work, all of these have kind of received increasing attention in the past 10 years or so, as have other approaches to reinventing retirement and reimagining what this extended retirement period could be. But has this led to a public discourse that has not necessarily captured the variety and complexity of lived experiences pertaining to later life? In particular, the issues faced by low-income workers, workers of color, and others marginalized due to their social positionality or social identities. So, further, trends and statistics that we often see are aggregated data, and that often obscures what I would argue is the most important information that we need to be paying attention to, how the most marginalized older adults are faring. So, next slide. For example, if we were to then look at life expectancy, but by race, here in the red circle, we can see that the highest ever Black life expectancy, which here in this graph occurred in 2014, was where white life expectancy was back in 1989. So while Black life expectancy is also increasing, there are some significant race-based differences that are obscured by looking at the curve as a whole without breaking it down by race. So that's just one example. Next slide. So if we look by race, gender, and social class here, we see even more evidence that social inequalities over the life course shape later life opportunities and outcomes in important ways. So we can see here that Black men with less than a high school education have a life expectancy that's about 20 years lower than the life expectancy of highly educated white women. And Kimberly Crenshaw, who I will tell you who she is in just a second, would call this injustice squared or even injustice cubed. But paradoxically, what we also see in this graph is that Hispanic men and women, regardless of education levels, fare pretty well or really well in terms of life expectancy. And so, without breaking it down by these different factors, we wouldn't see these differences necessarily. Our speaker, Dr. Rocio Calvo, will actually be touching a bit on this apparent paradox in her talk today as it relates to life satisfaction. But that brings me to this concept of intersectionality. So next slide, please. So what is intersectionality? So the term was coined by a legal scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw, pictured here, in the late 80s. And it describes the overlapping and intersecting social identities that often affect and inform how we move around in society. So some identities garner privilege and power, while others oppression and marginalization. Crenshaw argues that individuals' identities are not mutually exclusive, and you must really look at their intersection so as to not miss the key issue or the key issues, and to better inform solutions. So Crenshaw offers a simple analogy of an intersection of two roads as a frame here. So let's use this Venn diagram for an example. Let's take Jeanette. Jeanette is 62 years old and she is a Black worker. The roads of the intersection in this case would be the way the workforce is structured by age and race. And then the traffic in these roads would be the hiring policies and other practices that ran through these roads, right? So Jeanette is positioned precisely where age and race roads meet and overlap. So she experiences a simultaneous impact of the company's age and race traffic. So many of our institutions, policies, practices are set up to address harms that Jeanette might experience on the age road or on the race road, but what happens when you're experiencing both? If you were to add in a third road here, like sexuality, for example, as this Venn diagram shows, what happens then? Oftentimes in these situations, what you find is that folks are being impacted by multiple forces and then abandoned to fend for themselves because neither of the solutions in place don't precisely address the intersection of the identities. So having an intersectional lens allows us to see and address such issues. Each of our presenters today will report on their research and what they were able to learn, given that they came at it from an intersectional lens. So you'll see additional examples. Next slide, please. So social identities include a variety of factors, such as those listed here: age, race, ethnicity, education, ability, wealth, among many others. Next slide, please. So here's an example of a recent article in the media that really did use an intersectional lens to highlight that we're talking about race in America and about how Black and brown bodies are more likely to get sick and die from the coronavirus. We're also talking about older adults being at higher risk for the coronavirus right now. But are we really talking about being Black and older right now in America and what that means for folks? And this article kind of did a nice job of highlighting the unique intersection here. Next slide, please. So to demonstrate that point with some data, as you can see here, a recent study suggested that Blacks aged 65 to 74 died 5 times more often than whites from the coronavirus at the time the data was collected. And so here you can see the intersection of race and age and how the coronavirus has really, unfortunately, laid out bare some of these existing disparities, and it's really, you're able to see the harmful negative effects here. Next slide. All right, just to wrap up, why? Structural factors are really responsible here. Structural and institutional racism, poverty, and other forms of oppression are deeply ingrained in our institutions, and they trickle down to affect individual health outcomes. And that's what the social determinants of health is all about, and understanding kind of what those structural factors are and how they trickle downstream to affect individuals. And then next slide. Thank you. So in closing, what can we do about this? Well, first of all, when doing work around, increasing opportunities and access for older adults in different domains to engage in the ways that they want to and need to across the lifespan, and particularly in later life. All of these things in the four quadrants below are really important to work towards. But we cannot address age inequities without looking deeply at other isms like racism, classism, and ableism. And this has to be central to our work. One way to do this is to give voice to those who are most proximal to the inequity and listen to these voices when proposing and implementing solutions. And so I will stop there, and I will pass it on to my panelists, who will provide some additional examples here of what an intersectional lens looks like. Starting with our first panelist, Kendra Jason. Welcome, Kendra. Kendra Jason is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. She's an interdisciplinary health disparities scholar who examines individual level factors, contextual factors like the workplace, and life events that may influence the relationship between health and desired workforce participation in older African-American workers. She is currently on the steering committee for the Sloan Research Network on Aging and Work. Welcome, Kendra.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you for the invitation, all of the collective minds that came together to invite me to speak on older Black workers, low-wage workers in the context of COVID. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just briefly start by introducing you to my work as far as intersectionality. I look at older, Black, low-wage, full-time workers with chronic illness. And what I really want to understand is how the health and work challenges of this population can be supported by the workplace environment. So how can the workplace help or hinder them from moving forward? I also talk to these workers to see what strategies they have employed to remain engaged in work as long as they choose. And then I would like, of course, to be that bridge of communication between workers and management and organizations, forming interventions and offering recommendations so that older workers with these different intersections can work as long as they choose. I do have my website available here if you would like to look more specifically at my research in detail. Next slide, please. I am hugely passionate and driven by the simple fact that Black workers disproportionately face challenges in labor market compensation and retirement benefits. Next slide, please. As Tina described, there is an ongoing and slightly new conversation about working longer and what that means for the American workforce. Americans are able to work longer due to advances in technology, medicine, and other means. And Black workers in particular are working longer for financial support and health insurance. And this relationship is even further compounded when that individual is a low-wage worker and does not even have a conception of retirement, that has no plan for retirement because they cannot afford to retire. Next slide, please. So where does this come from? And I'm thankful that Tina laid out that intersectional introduction for you so that you can understand these earning differences do embody a life course perspective. And so what you can see here from 1979 to 2020, African-American adults are represented by that Black squiggly line. Unfortunately, that's at the bottom of many graphs about social benchmarks. And Black workers over time have earned less income than all other workers. Next slide, please. And this gap does continue to grow. So again, from 1979 to 2015, you can see how the gap is actually growing wider instead of getting smaller when it comes to income between Black and white workers in particular. Next slide, please. So if you think about it, yes, where does this come from, right? If you think about it, your Social Security, your 401k, and if your job offers pensions, is directly tied to your individual employment history and wages. And so because of racial discrimination over the life course, because of economic oppression that Black workers have faced, Black workers earn less income over the life course. Not only do they have less income, but they're less likely to have insurance support in comparison to their white counterparts. Another key factor for Black workers is unionization, because unions give access to denied benefit plans. And so since unionization has decreased so drastically in the United States, that leaves Black workers, again, on the negative consequences of having less access to fair benefits. Next slide, please. So discrimination plays a role. So research has found that those who face regular discrimination are disproportionately burdened by multiple chronic conditions and thus face greater challenges when they want to continue work. And research has also found that even the perception of discrimination produces stress that increases these negative effects related to having health conditions, health risks, and the ability to function later in life. Next slide, please. So when we look specifically at Black and white Black and white adults in later life, Black adults suffer more chronic illnesses, have poorer health outcomes, and higher death rates compared to nearly all other racial groups. They report higher rates of diabetes, hypertension, asthma, arthritis, obesity in comparison to whites. And even when you consider mental health, older Black adults, experience higher rates of depression than older white adults. Next slide, please. So COVID-19 has exacerbated these issues when it comes to racial injustice and the outcome of employment precarity. Next slide, please. So if you look at this graph here, you'll see that from February to May of this year, those ages 25 to 54 had a 11% loss in employment, okay? Of course, this is due to the effects of COVID-19. For ages 55 to 64, a loss of 10%. But then those 65 and older, a loss of nearly 17%. So if you look at this in comparison, for those ages 55 plus, they've lost or had a over 25% loss, which is over double that of those ages 25 to 54. The thing that makes COVID so devastating for older workers is that it's related to health risk. And as those health risks increase, so does the unemployment rates. Next slide, please. So the CDC back in July released a report that said people from racial and ethnic minority groups are disproportionately represented in essential work settings. We all know this. This is not news to us anymore. But to really think about those people having a greater chance to be exposed to the virus because of their close contact with the public, because they're not able to work from home, and because they do not have paid sick days. Next. So the media has released some reports about older Black workers. Click slide, please. Click the slide, please. Thank you. Among older workers, Blacks and women face higher COVID-19 risks. Those over 55 remain victims of employment crisis. Can you click the slide again? And then just thinking about race and age in general, health workers, especially minorities, at high risk for COVID, even with personal protection equipment. workers facing racism and economic inequality, and then Black essential workers twice as likely to experience retaliation during a pandemic. Next slide, please. So fortunately, there have been some really good research by some scholars of color, especially Black researchers who've been dealing with health disparity research and have quickly connected the effects of COVID. These are just a few of the research that's been reported in the journals of gerontology, health education and behavior, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of American Medical Association. They all generally give you statistics, but really talk about structural racism and how the pandemic disproportionately negatively impacts older Black people, especially, but ethnic and racial minorities. Next slide, please. So I want to end with some workplace recommendations for COVID and beyond. One thing is that workplaces really need to be thoughtful and think of creative and innovative ways to better support older workers. Go beyond flexible work arrangements. Think of more nuanced ways to stage retirement. Have policies, equipment, practices, in my ergonomic practices in mind. We need better adherence to the American Disability Act. We need more social support programs that seek to understand how racism, sexism, ableism operate locally within your workplaces and then address those things. We need stronger enforcement on race, gender, and age discrimination. And we also need workplaces to work with legislature to create policies to ensure economic security and safety through Social Security, retirement, and public assistance. Mary Gaeta has spoken a lot on this about older workers and policy. You can see her research as well. Next slide. And I just want to end with some research recommendations, really center the experiences of Black workers. There's a saying that when America has a cold, Black Americans have the flu. The employment sector is another place where you can find this. Older Black women are another place for you to focus your research. Older Black women are caregivers, work in low wage work, service work, but they're also in professional jobs and are very socially mobile. So they're a great resource to figure out strategy and maintenance and resilience. Think about the workplace as a point of analysis. And then fund community-based research designs. Again, those researchers who are already reporting on COVID and its disparate effects have been doing this research and have been struggling with funding. And now their voices are amplified. So please support and fund Black health disparities researchers who can really give us some insight since they've been doing this work for a number of years. I thank you for your time and I'll answer questions later.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kendra. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Rocio Calvo. Dr. Calvo is an associate professor of global practice at the Boston College School of Social Work. She's also the founding director of the Latinx Leadership Initiative, or otherwise known as the LLI, at Boston College, and co-leads the Grand Challenge Initiative, Achieve Equity, Equal Opportunity for All of the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare. Her work focuses on the role of public services in the integration of immigrants and how socioeconomic and cultural factors optimize or jeopardize the life satisfaction of immigrants throughout their immigration careers. With a grant from the Russell Sage Foundation right now, Rocio is exploring the experiences of older Latinx adults specifically. Thank you so much, Rocio.
Thank you, Tina, and good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to be here to be talking about my research with older Latino immigrants and the older Latino population overall. I specifically would like to focus on an aspect of my research that intends to look at what do we mean by meaning and purpose for an intersectional perspective. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by meaning and purpose from an intersectional perspective? What I focus is on happiness. I look at the happiness of older Latinos. Why? Because Latinos are in the United States, one of the groups that live longer than any other groups, yet they reach late life, maybe with fewer economic resources and more functional limitations than other groups of older adults, given a lifelong experience of lack of access to opportunities and to discrimination. So when we look at how we face this longevity that Tina was talking at the beginning from an intersectional perspective, we look at the approaches that we usually look at, like successful aging, productive aging, we may assume that maybe Latinos, given the characteristics they have as a group, when they reach late life, maybe perhaps less successful or less productive than other groups. So I look at happiness because it gives you an alternative indicator of success at late in life. Why it gives you an alternative indicator of success? Because it's very, very close related to meaning and purpose. Let me let me explain briefly what do I mean by happiness, so this all makes sense. Happiness has two main components. One is an affective component, how happy I am with today when I woke up and I saw the rain, you know, that makes me not happy. That is immediate, and that is related to my feelings. How happy I am that I'm eating my favorite lunch. How happy I am that I spending time with my children. The happiness I study is the other component, how satisfied I am with my life. If I ask you to close your eyes for 1 second and to think of your life overall until now, everything that is in it, that is long-term, and I ask you how satisfied you are with your life, it requires an assessment of everything, an overall take on it. It's not only the work you have, it's not only how much money you have. Although those things are very important indeed, the meaning and purpose that you give those different elements are as important, if not more, than the elements itself. And that is key because it allows people to rate their level of satisfaction according to what they consider important, not according to external factors that may be imposed upon them, especially from a normative way to look at life satisfaction. For instance, how much you volunteer, how are you engaged? We usually have only one perspective, rather than, as Tina said at the beginning, giving people the voice of what do they value and what makes them satisfied with their life. So this is where I look at, because at the end of the day, what I want to pinpoint are cultural factors that influence the successful aging of Latinos with their own measures, not with the measures that are imposed upon them from outside. Next slide, please. So I look at this with some of my colleagues, one of them, Tina, and we found a paradox. Latinos, as I told you, reach all their life with fewer economic resources, more functional limitations, poorer health. All those are indicators that has been associated with life satisfaction. Yet, they are the group of older adults that are more satisfied with their lives of all other groups in the United States, even than groups that have more economic resources and better health, for instance, like non-Hispanic whites. So, and that was puzzling, because why is that the case? Why they are doing things that we know, data show, research shows that they are according to the parameters that we use to measure successful aging, they are not that successful, or other indicators that we use, for instance, to measure productive aging. They tend to retire earlier than others. They tend to work less. They tend to work because they have more functional limitations, or because they chose to retire. We know that they retire earlier than the non-Hispanic whites. So they are not engaged in work in later life as much as, for instance, the non-Hispanic whites. They have almost no economic resources. Most Latinos in the United States, don't plan for retirement economically. If they have any, most of their retirement is based on Social Security. So they live with very little resources, and they don't engage in volunteering. What I want to put the emphasis here is that applying the normative, the wide way to look at what makes you productive or successful late in life, did not, from the perspective, was not useful to look at Latinos. Next slide, please. So we keep digging of why this is the case. And we look at other data sets where we follow what people do for 24 hours. Because our hypothesis was there are either two things here. Either Latinos engage in activities that has not been studied in traditional categories of productive or of productive aging, that gives them meaning and purpose, or they derive more meaning and purpose from the activities that has been traditionally associated with, for instance, productive aging. And we found that Latinos tend to involve less often in activities that have been associated with productive aging later in life, like volunteering or working, whether paid or unpaid. So that was yet another confirmation that our hypothesis was supported, that we need, from an intersectional perspective, to look at different factors. What we found is that Latinos do activities or engage more often in activities like religious participation or other activities like cooking that give them more meaning and purpose later in life that, for instance, to any other group of older adults in the United States, specifically if we compare them with non-Hispanic whites. So the lessons we learn here and what we do is to, when we look at aging and life satisfaction and meaning and purpose later in life, specifically if we are thinking, for instance, in civic engagement, is important to expand our array of our understanding of how different people and different groups of older adults, in this case Latinos, may find meaningful or gives them purpose in life. Let me finish with this. Right now, I am involved in a fascinating project when we are conducting 300 in-depth interviews with older Latinos in the United States from different countries, just looking at what gives them meaning and purpose. And it's fascinating because there is a lot of variability. Another mistake would be to conceive Hispanics as a monolithic group. They are not. It varies a lot by country of origin, how long they have been in the United States, when you come to the United States. So I guess the lesson learned and the action to be taken, as Tina was saying at the beginning, and I have to concur with her, is to give voice to those individuals that we are working with and to expand our understanding of the factors that give meaning and purpose late in life with different populations. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rocio. Now, Dr. Cal Halverson is an assistant professor at the Boston College School of Social Work. His research interests include the antecedents, experiences, and outcomes of longer working lives, with emphasis on later life self-employment and entrepreneurship, encore careers, and older adults as social innovators. Cal was selected as an inaugural member of the 2018 to 2019 Encore Public Voices Fellowship and has taught courses related to aging societies, social work practice, and research methods at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. Welcome, Cal.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tina. So I study issues of work, both paid and unpaid, past midlife and well into the traditional retirement years. And meaning and purpose certainly has a lot to do with this. So before joining academia, as Tina said, I was the director of research at encore.org. In my time there, and before even as an MSW student, I worked on issues related to how to increase the socio-demographic diversity of older volunteers, as well as research and programs related to encore careers, older adults as social innovators, and helping community colleges and universities to become more welcoming and supportive of older students seeking to change careers. So while there, I also started to think a lot about older adults as entrepreneurs. And so after deciding to leave this dynamic organization to pursue my dream of a PhD, I continued down this path. I've still focused some of my efforts on institutions of higher education, and particularly social work programs, as I'm a proud social worker within the School of Social Work, can be more welcoming to students at or past midlife. I also focus some of my research on the Senior Community Service Employment Program, working with the Massachusetts Executive Office of Elder Affairs to identify ways to strengthen the sole federal workforce program for low-income older workers. And a lot of my time is devoted to getting a better understanding of self-employment and entrepreneurship in later life. And to be clear, these terms, self-employment and entrepreneurship, are often used interchangeably in research and the media, even though they can sometimes mean different things. So today, I will focus on this last topic, self-employment and entrepreneurship. And in the first part of my talk, I'll provide some statistics derived from the Health and Retirement Study, a nationally representative study of approximately 20,000 Americans over the age of 50 that is funded by the National Institute on Aging and the US Social Security Administration. So for at least the past dozen years, and considering only those who are in the labor force, we've had a consistent rate of about 1 in 5 workers over the age of 50 being self-employed. In other words, a little more than 20% of all workers past the age of 50 work for themselves. Yet using a life course framework, we know that these rates might differ by age among the older workers themselves. And this is indeed true with to use a pretty unscientific word, a giant difference by age groups. While only about 1 in 6 people in their early 50s are self-employed, about 1 in 3 are self-employed by their late 60s, and about 1 in 2, or half of workers, are self-employed by the time they pass the age of 80. Now that is a big difference with age. Reasons include an increasing desire for flexible work, for meaning and purpose with age, as well as with the desire to be one's own boss. Yet it also includes the fact that age discrimination is real, and it becomes increasingly difficult to find work the older you are. So the answer for many is to work for themselves. So as we start to think about intersectionality, I'm actually in the process of developing a series of research briefs through the Center on Aging and Work at Boston College that break down the statistics I just provided by key sociodemographic factors. So I'll give you just 2 examples here, gender and race. So looking again at the past dozen or so years and considering only people 50 and older and only people within the labor force, the share of older male workers who are self-employed has been about 10% higher than the share of older female workers who are self-employed. In other words, men are more likely to be self-employed than women. Yet, how do these rates differ by age among older working Americans by gender? While the rates of self-employment increase with age among both men and women in the labor force, the rates increase the most dramatically for men. So among workers in their early 50s, the share of men who are self-employed is not actually that much different than that for women. Yet among workers over the age of 80, the share of men who work for themselves is nearly 20% higher than that of women. So that's a pretty big difference. And lastly, what about if we consider race? So in this instance, I'll only consider individuals who identify as either white or Black due to data limitations from the data set I'm analyzing. So in the past dozen years or so, and again, looking at all people over the age of 50 and all people who are working, the share of the older white population that reports being self-employed has also consistently been about 10% higher than the older Black population who is self-employed. But again, how does this differ by age groups among older workers? Well, I found that among those who are in their early 50s, the share of the older white respondents who are self-employed was just slightly higher than that of older Black respondents. Yet this difference increased dramatically with age. And by the time you looked at people in their late 70s, the share of white respondents who were self-employed was about 17% higher than older Black respondents. And this increased even more among those older than 80. So to be clear, all of the statistics I just listed were what we often call descriptive statistics. They are easy to understand and they do a relatively good job of providing an overview of the self-employment picture among older Americans. Yet it can sometimes help to control for other potential confounding factors that might cloud the results, perhaps affecting them and their implications. So in a separate study that's now in press in the journal, The Gerontologist, I looked at the predictors of self-employment among older people while controlling for a variety of factors. And for this study, and using an intersectionality framework, what I did was break the analysis down into two parts: workers ages 50 to 61 and workers ages 62 and older. So why did I do it this way? Well, 62 is the age in which people can file for early Social Security retirement benefits. And I was curious how having access to this important part of one's financial safety net and being close to Medicare eligible age of 65 might relate to the key factors that are related to self-employment. And here's what I found. Among older self-employed people ages 50 to 61, and while controlling for a variety of sociodemographic factors, the odds of being self-employed among older Black Americans was about 60% lower than the odds of being self-employed among older white Americans. Yet when looking at the group age 62 and older, this discrepancy was dramatically reduced. In fact, there was no statistically significant relationship between race and self-employment in this oldest group. And this difference between the two age groups was significantly different, which means that the odds of being self-employed for Black Americans in the older group was higher than their younger counterparts. So everything I've talked about so far relates to rates of self-employment. Yet what about interest? This is where I really started to think about the ways we could increase the diversity of older self-employed people. In a separate study using another nationally representative data set of people aged 50 to 70 residing in the US, I found that older Black Americans were more than twice as likely to report a high level of interest in starting a new organization in the next 5 to 10 years. More so, education, health, marital status, income, and wealth, all things that are related to self-employment in later life that I didn't have time to discuss today, were not related to interest. In other words, interest in entrepreneurship in later life is more egalitarian, yet actual entrepreneurship is not. So what does this all mean? Well, first and foremost, there's a lot of interest in self-employment, running your own business, being your own boss, being in charge of your schedule and working on things that you want to work on. These are all reasons why people are interested in this. Yet among older adults, a range of sociodemographic factors may relate to accessing opportunities, and race and systemic racism are a part of this reason. White Americans in general have access to more affordable banks and lending institutions than people of color, giving them more access to small business financing. They also tend to have larger social or professional networks that have access to key contacts who can help them start their new businesses. And white Americans in general have more wealth than Black Americans, and we know that higher levels of wealth can help someone weather the storm if their organization or their venture flops. So how might we go about fixing this? Well, reshaping our institutions so people, regardless of race or socioeconomic background, receive similar economic opportunities would help dramatically. In fact, I would argue that a key way to increase the diversity of who is able to become self-employed would be to strengthen our social safety net. It is telling that when people become 62 and gain access to Social Security retirement benefits, that the diversity of who is self-employed also increases. Other researchers have shown that self-employment rates actually increase once people qualify for Medicare at 65. These are not small programs serving small needs. Social Security provides foundational financial security, and Medicare provides both financial and health security. In the US, one's place of work is the primary place where people receive healthcare and save for retirement. And we know that self-employed people are far less likely to have health insurance or to be saving for retirement than people working in more traditional wage and salary jobs. In fact, we know that many people who decide not to become self-employed do so because they're afraid they're going to lose access to their workplace healthcare and retirement benefits. This has often been called entrepreneurship lock. Separately, in looking at other age groups, we know that receiving SNAP benefits, otherwise known as food stamps, increases rates of entrepreneurship. And so does allowing people who are taking unemployment insurance to begin new businesses. As a case in point, even though we tend to think of the US as one of the most entrepreneurial countries in the world, we actually have the lowest self-employment rate of all countries tracked by the OECD at about 6%. Meanwhile, countries where more people have access to the social safety net, regardless of where they work, have higher rates of self-employment, such as at 10% in Germany and 15% in the UK. So self-employment, while a fantastic form of work on many levels that can help people to pursue work with meaning and a sense of purpose, is also a pretty precarious form of work, and ways we can buffer the negative effects of this work would very likely increase the diversity of who can join in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cal. So now I'm going to introduce two speakers. Abby Helsinger joined the Scripps Gerontology Center at Miami University as a senior research associate in February 2020 after a 15-year career in preventative health and chronic disease prevention at local YMCA organizations in Ohio and YMCA of the United States in Chicago. Samuel Van Vliet joined Miami University as a graduate student in August of 2019. And after the completion of his bachelor's degree in psychology and applied gerontology from the University of North Texas. Both Abby and Samuel work closely with Dr. Phyllis Cummins at the Scripps Gerontology Center as well. So welcome, Abby and Samuel.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. My name, as she said, is Samuel Van Vliet, graduate researcher here at Miami University in Ohio. And today I would like to be discussing the strategies of engaging marginalized adults in education and training programs. Okay, perfect. You can go to the next slide, please. Perfect. Awesome. Our project utilized virtual interviews with 61 experts in adult education and training from 10 different countries. There are many challenges of engaging and retraining racial and ethnic minority older adults. We see that the opportunities for adult education training are often pursued by higher income and higher skilled adults. And the concern here is that the lack of training opportunities puts marginalized groups at a larger disadvantage than they previously were at. And all of these barriers have now been increased due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. So if you're looking here at this graph, you look to the right side of the graph, we see that the Black population has been impacted the greatest from COVID-19 related to unemployment. Specifically, the most impacted group was Black American populations with less than a high school diploma. Next slide. And as we look at this graph, we see that Hispanic and Black adults were far more likely to cancel or change their education plans due to COVID-19. Next slide. So what does this all mean? Well, we're looking at the different barriers in which people have participation in difficulties retraining in education programs. We see that these are manifested in categories such as situational barriers, institutional barriers, and dispositional barriers. Situational barriers are often, but not limited to, cost of education, lack of time, issues with childcare, difficulties with transportation, and general support from family and friends. Next slide. This quote is from an Australian informant related to formal education for adults aged 40 to 45, and it reads, those people don't have the ability to change direction. Because if you want to do formal educational training in Australia, if you want to do university education, it's going to cost you, and it means withdrawing from the workforce. As we see from this quote, the pursuit of formal education can be a large setback for the workforce population. Potential strategies for these financial barriers might be the shaping of expansion of Pell Grants and other financial opportunities for subpopulation in response to the recognition of long-time structures, policies, and practices that have led to inequitable outcomes for learners. Other countries, for instance, offer assistance for attaining adult education. In Norway, employers often receive subsidies from the government for providing training in the workplace. In Italy, adult learning programs are often free and normally no charge for students. Next slide. Another barrier for adult education are institutional barriers. Adult students often struggle with these barriers, barriers like lack of time, lack of information needed to complete an education program, lack of access to computer and internet, difficulties in enrollment processes, and inconvenient and inflexible course scheduling. Next slide. The quote in bold is referring to technological barriers for adult education. It reads, older adults' access to technology and skills is actually quite limited. And we'll show more information on the next slide regarding these difficulties in access to technology and what they mean. Next slide. So that's the slide. This graph shows the percentage of adults with difficulties attaining reliable internet and computer access. It is clear to see that adults from marginalized communities are more likely to have lack of access to the needed education and training materials. Some potential strategies for this might be to combat these barriers with offering additional support to students who have a lack of familiarity with online learning and computers in general. Also, ensuring that students have access to internet at home is crucial and a fundamental aspect to online learning. This could mean that internet providers may offer no or low cost internet access to low income households. In addition to that, we also see that finally we could be working to ensure that students have access to computer and equipment, technological equipment at home. This comes in the form maybe of grants and funding sources that might be available to provide low income households with computer and the technology needed to continue their education and training. And now I'll turn it over to Abby.
Thanks, Samuel. I don't know if my video will start and go on to the next slide. So we'll talk next about dispositional barriers, and that's going to be our final category, and we'll really spend the most time here because our informants really highlighted dispositional barriers. Dispositional barriers include lack of confidence in their ability, concern about being too old, being tired of school, having a lack of enjoyment in studying. And can we have this slide? And go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. So as you can see, this quote is really regarding feelings of failure, and it reads, second chance learners, so those learners who were returning to study after having a checkered history of learning in school, they had very negative perceptions of themselves as learners, that they were stupid, that they couldn't learn, they'd never been a good learner, they didn't have the skill or capabilities to learn, which is terrible to think that these people had held these internal dialogues about their capacity to learn for so long. On the next slide, our quote regarding concerns about being too old reads, there are very few programs for people above the age of 45. On the next slide, concerning lack of motivation and confidence, we see they have that opportunity, but you have the problem we mentioned before, that it's not always easy to motivate other people to start schooling again. So that is the problem. And finally, on the next slide, we see the challenge with traditional approaches. The quote is, herein lies the fundamental problem with educational training. It puts out curriculum that says, here's what you have to learn. Here's what you have to know. It takes no account of what people already know. A lot of people have had really rich lives. They can do almost anything. They can't necessarily sit in a room and be bored by people using pedagogies and content and technologies which are alien to them. It's the worst form. It's the worst form of abuse that you can get, is to put people through that. So the strategies to overcome dispositional barriers include offering programs and courses with academic and non-academic support available beyond the hours of the traditional day, because our adult learners typically have other competing priorities during the traditional day, and operating in ways that attract and retain their life and work experiences via adult-friendly strategies, such as offering prior learning assessments and providing flexible course offerings. One of our key informants from Australia quoted, what they would call micro-credentialing courses, where they've built workshops on community development community development that the sector can add, and then they get an accreditation toward another qualification. So there's that sort of micro-credentialing through professional development, which I think is probably really groundbreaking in that sector. On the next slide, as we wrap up, we wanted to share this figure showing responses to a question posed to Americans ages 18 to 64. If you were to enroll in education or training in the next 6 months, what would be your goal? As you can see, 63% of American adults considering enrolling prefer non-degree programs. So those are certificates or certifications, licenses, courses to get some skills they need for work, or courses for personal interest. And this is consistent with our findings in our other research that investigated students ages 40 and older enrolled in Ohio's community colleges. The importance of our study and findings is really highlighted on the next slide. As you can see, when looking at attainment of associate's degree or higher by race and ethnicity in the US, the disparity among Blacks, American Indians, and Hispanics is really clear. Fewer than half of Americans who identify in these groups have degrees compared to their white or Asian and Pacific Islander counterparts. In summary, on the next slide, participants in adult education and training, or participating in adult education and training is critical to have skills demanded by employers. Unfortunately, lack of training opportunities for older adults may place them at a disadvantage. And as we saw, COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted racial and ethnic minority groups. Recruitment efforts tailored to support underserved, minority, middle-aged, and older adult workers are needed, and administrators should operate from an equity and inclusion lens, as individual experiences are not monolithic. Finally, as we saw 2 slides ago, to retain adult learners, multiple learning forms are necessary, including formal, non-formal, and informal learning. On the next slide, we just want to share that our references are available upon request, and we would like to recognize the research here was supported by the Institute of Education Sciences, U.S. Department of Education. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Samuel and Abby. So that was our last panelist, and now we can move on to the question and answer session. It looks like we have about 15 minutes for question and answer, and I'm going to introduce our moderator for this portion, Dr. Jackie James. Jackie is a director of the Sloan Research Network on Aging and Work and the research professor in the Lynch School of Education at Boston College. Her research is focused on the meaning and experience of work, gender roles and stereotypes, adult development, perceptions of older workers, and emerging retirement issues. Thanks so much, Jackie.
Thank you. And thank you to those panelists. That was just fantastic. We're so grateful to you for joining us and for presenting that wonderful work that you've all been doing. I'm having trouble with my video, I'm sorry. Okay, so a lot of questions came in, and I tried to answer some of them as I could while things were going on, short ones. But if I didn't answer some that I don't get to here, please do email us and we will get back to you. My first question is addressed to Kendra, because people were asking something about the extent to which, you were talking about the barriers and the constraints that Black low-wage workers are faced with, and people are saying, isn't that going to get exponentially worse if the Affordable Care Act is eliminated? Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, thank you, Jackie, and thank you to the person who asked that question. I mean, I think the obvious answer is, of course, if it's not replaced or re-envisioned in some way, the Affordable Care Act will, or the lack of the Affordable Care Act will leave so many Americans in a very dire situation, especially where one of the conditions was that you did not have to have pre-existing conditions. And so what we know in our research is that, chronic conditions start as early as 35. 50 is the age where you get more than one chronic condition. Medicare, which takes care of those over 65, you're just going to have a population that is not living to the age of 65 so that they can garner the benefits of the access of healthcare in that way. And so I think a lot of people should be concerned. And that's why, of course, that was one of the main issues on the political platform this year. And so I don't have any answers for the person who answered, other than, of course, and I hope that, our government is creative in finding a way to support older workers and workers with disabilities.
Thank you. And one more, just to comment too, in our audience are people who have lost their jobs that they believe are due to age in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and they do not believe they were given honest answers by their employers. Do you have comments about that? Is that a common experience?
Well, like one of the reports that I mentioned in my talk, Black workers especially are facing retaliation at higher rates in the face of COVID. This is when, they report people not following protocol or, any other little issue. And so this is a case where I think it's fair to say that racism, sexism, and other isms sneak into the workplace and give employers an excuse to get rid of workers. Ageism is a huge issue that everyone on the committee has been tackling for a number of years. And so unfortunately, and another thing with COVID has been so recent and so fast that we have not had an opportunity to really grasp what's going on in the workplaces. We're still in the very early ages of gathering data and understanding the short-term implications of COVID, not even to mention what the long-term implications could be. So again, I don't have the best answer because COVID is just so new and so fresh and so devastating. But we hope that's what this team, the panelists here are working towards, a better understanding of this pandemic, a better understanding of the situation that older workers deal with, so we can better respond to the needs of this very, very essential group.
Yes, thank you. I think those are very good answers. Thank you, Kendra. And then my next question is for Theo. This is a question several people wanted to know, Theo, is, you talked about the happiness of the older Latinx population, and people want to know if younger generations of Latinos will be as happy, or whether they have assimilated into the US swine that we know about. Those are my words, not theirs.
Thank you for that question. It's interesting. I've looked at the happiness of working age immigrants compared to the native born population. And what I found is that they are less happy. I only have found the older adults happier than I only have found this paradox with the older adult population. Keep in mind that aging makes us happier. As we age, we all become happier in general. It's the Latinos that is when it flips. It's Latinos that become the happiest of all. My hypothesis is that they have a life, what they do give them more meaning and purpose. They derive more meaning and purpose from what they do than other groups. But now that I'm conducting these in-depth interviews, I am seeing that there is a lot of variability by country of origin, time in the United States, but still there is a general trend that they are very satisfied with their lives in the United States because of the meaning and purpose that they derive. They are very satisfied with what they have accomplished in life.
Do you think that this, any of this happiness factor is about the different level of family involvement? If you could answer quickly so I can get to.
Yes, in our aggregate data, in our national data, we saw that realizing certain activities like cooking, for instance, talking about work, Latinos derive more happiness working when they collaborate with colleagues than working by themselves. They derive more happiness and more meaning, specifically more meaning when they are involved in activities that require collaboration and they do these activities with others.
And real quickly, can I ask you one more real quickly, because I want to get to a question for Abby as well. What kinds of questions did you ask to get at the happiness that you described?
I use a question that has been, I have two questions. In the first studies where we look at general trends with the health and retirement data, we look at how satisfied you are with your life overall. That measure is literature showed is an established measure for life satisfaction, the cognitive evaluation. In the second study, where we use the American Times Use Survey, where we follow people for 24 hours, we ask people how satisfied you are with what you do. For 24 hours, we measure what you are involved with and with whom, and how much meaning, what is the meaning you derive from this. And now in the qualitative interviews that we are doing is we ask them how satisfied they are with their life, what and why. What makes you so satisfied? What are those factors?
Thank you so much for that, Rocío.
My pleasure.
Abby, somebody says, I'm thinking about how varied the populations of people are who are not working at 50. Some people are the poorest they've ever been because of losing their jobs. Some other people are better off financially because they have Social Security and Medicare and so on. And yet we have these very few undifferentiated public training programs. Can you address how such programs should be designed given all these differences?
So, what we heard over and over from our key informants is that we need to have multiple opportunities for learning, adult education and training. So, and that really calls back to thinking about formal, non-formal, and informal learning opportunities. And our graph showed that, again, 63%, that was specifically Americans, preferred programs that weren't what we would call formal. They weren't looking specifically for degrees, but they were looking for opportunities for a certificate or a certification or a training that would help them advance in their career, whether that's, a brief training on how to use Excel even. So what we heard was important is that all of those opportunities are available for our adult learners, and really focusing on non-formal education would be things, again, that they are organized learning opportunities. They might take place in a workforce or even in a classroom, but they don't necessarily lead to a degree. And then what we heard from several countries were around opportunities for maybe even more informal learning. So we heard from Australia about men's sheds that were important not only for learning opportunities, but really for social engagement, which of course now is incredibly important. And then of course the challenges those organizations have are how do they continue to engage their adult learners even in a virtual setting if that continues to be necessary.
Okay, thank you.
And I think one last thing the only thing that I would add to what Abby said is to the question of how can these programs be designed? They should just be designed primarily with the community of interest at the center of it. Think about what the communities that you're trying to engage with, what they would be interested in, how you can reach them, and what they want to be involved in. Because those are major elements that play a factor into whether someone's going to get into something. If they're going to be involved, if they're going to seek it out, you can tell when someone is kind of going at something and it doesn't fit your mold or what you're looking for. So getting in touch with the community of interest is crucial to developing any program, any development going forward.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. And another comment someone made had to do with that is if the first chance, if you offer somebody a second chance that looks just like the first chance, what's going to make them interested in taking that up? It's got to be something different, right? Yeah. So we're almost out of time. I did want to ask Cal if he could address, you know, I think most of you, all of you on this panel, think about your work in the narrow confines of your research and your academic circles. What do you think a non-academic audience needs to know on the basis of the work that you do? And I don't think I have time for everybody to answer that, but I'd love to start with Cal and ask him to answer that. And then if we have time, maybe one more.
You know, one of the biggest things I'd say is we don't realize just how many people work for themselves. And so if we're looking at people over the age of 50, it's 1 out of every 5 people work for themselves who are in the labor force. And that's giant. And they are not protected. But even if we just expand this and we look at the entire life course, that remains to be true. And so there is a large portion of our labor force who is working, but is unable to afford their health care that they would normally get if they worked for someone else, for a decently sized organization that gave them healthcare benefits. They're not saving for retirement. And so even if we look at self-employed people in their 20s and 30s and 40s, I have grave concerns for their future financial security and their future health, because we have created a system that is not supporting them. And so to me, like, you know, yeah, you're right. We can get into our little niches with our research, but this is very important because we are not providing a safety net for one of the key creators of jobs in our country, which is entrepreneurs. And if we wanted to create more jobs, I would argue we should support our entrepreneurs and our self-employed people.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask one more. Kendra, I want to ask you, I know that you get, you offered so much information about the barriers and constraints that Black low-wage workers face. And I know that there would be people who would say that the kinds of jobs they have don't lead to having this idea of meaning and purpose. Can you address that in a 1-minute answer as we close?
Yes, I can. And one thing, this is an excellent question. One thing, there's this huge misconception that low-wage workers do not have dignity at work, and they do. One of the main things that come out of my talks is how much pride and dignity and respect and how much meaning that these individuals get from doing their jobs and doing their jobs well. And having a health condition is so frustrating to them because it limits them from being able to do the jobs that they have so much pride in doing those things well. And so going back to the whole thing about meaning and purpose, just because you're a low-wage worker, just because you're in a physical job does not mean you're a devalued person in society, and that you're very meaningful and have a very, very meaningful contribution. And just one last thing I wanted to tag on what Cal just said. I would like non-academics to know or to realize that you have a group of researchers out here who are really advocating for them. One of the things that I really appreciate and enjoy when I talk about my research with someone, they say, "Oh, that's my grandmother. Oh, that's a situation I know, my mom is in," and they're just so excited that their marginalized story is centered in someone's research agenda, and that they are meaningful and purposeful in someone, in someone's research and someone's career. And so that's really meaningful beyond the realm of academia as well.
Well, I think that is a fantastic note to end on, and I am so inspired by the work that all of you are doing, and Tina and Cal and Doug and all of us appreciate so much your willingness to join us today. I'm going to turn it back over to, I believe it's Doug now, to close out the program. Thank you all for joining us again.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Tina, and all the presenters. It says I'm not able to start my video, but maybe I can now. Well, if you can hear my voice, we'll do without the face. What I would like to do is to say a big thank you, first of all, to Tina and Jackie and all of the presenters, and to all of you who have attended and asked such good questions. You know, this has been a very rich and enlightening discussion, and it would be wonderful if we could find a way to translate the research agenda into an agenda for action. Because we're going to change these things only if all of us become engaged and find steps to take, you know, one at a time, moving forward to deal with these structural issues, because without that, we're not going to see change. And of course, this is a hugely complicated challenge, because as we've identified in this whole notion of intersectionality, there are lots of little pieces and they're moving and they're interrelated. But we have to understand how they interrelate and what the opportunities are to make change over time. And I think that would be a wonderful way to build on the start that we've made today in terms of understanding this concept. So in closing, I want to remind you that we have recorded this and we'll be sending you the link next week, so that you can refer to it, you can share it, you can listen to it again. And we also will include the links that have been noted in the various presentations. We want to make you aware that this coming March, we will have our next program for the Future of Aging series. This one will focus on housing. The theme will be finding your way to home, new options for later life. And this is another issue that's brought into stark relief by the pandemic, and we'll explore the range of options for safe, affordable housing with reasonable access to services and quality of life. And by registering for this webinar, you'll be among the first to know the details for this next one. Finally, I want to thank our sponsors again, Encore Boston Network, the Center on Aging and Work at Boston College, the CNAP Alliance, the Fuss Center for Research on Aging and Intergenerational Studies at LaSalle University, and the Massachusetts Gerontology Association. You'll find lots of additional resources on their respective websites, and we'll send you those links next week. So thanks again from the Future of Aging Coalition, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon.